Yeah, I mean, I see all of Rob's stuff because I know his office, so they make transcripts available. I don't know if anybody else is live streaming it, though.
I don't do it 100% of the time, but whenever possible, I do.
Yeah.
Unless we're in someplace really remote.
It's fantastic. How do I get started? That's not going to make well, that's a full glass. It's not making much of a noise. Thank you. Thank you, Courtney. By the way, first of all, welcome. I hope you had a chance to enjoy your dinner. I also hope, if you haven't already, before you leave this evening, you get to say hello to my colleagues that make this possible. Courtney Hara, Kendall Crolius, who many of you know I've worked with for a long time, Matt Hagenmiller, who is leading our Board Excellence program, Tom McAteer, who develops most of our content that we share afterwards, never attributed to anybody, but we always share the best ideas. So thank you. This is our sort of dinner discussion. I always thought, first of all, Neel, thank you for doing this.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I always think it's, even though you assume people know it, I think it's always worth reminding you, what exactly does a regional Federal Reserve CEO and president do? And describe a little bit about what the office does, and then what you actually do every day.
Sure. Well, thanks again for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. I spend about a third of my time on management issues. We have about 1,000 people at the Minneapolis Fed. We're one of the smaller regional Feds, but there are management issues that come up in any organization. I spend about a third of my time doing things like this, getting out across our region, which I'll describe in a moment, talking to members of the public and learning, hearing what's on your mind. And then about a third of my time deep into policy development, whether it's monetary policy or regulatory policy, and I love the policy development. So those three legs of the stool are a very good fit for my interests and my background, and so I find it to be very energizing to be a regional bank president. But I think it's worth stepping back even further and looking at what the Federal Reserve System is. I mean, obviously it's the nation's central bank, but I always like to start by explaining why do we have all these regional banks around the country. And it's a feature of American history, which is our country has always hated the idea of having a central bank at all, because it sounded very undemocratic, a bunch of bankers in a dark room doing God knows what. I mean, this is why I'm live streaming this, so it's not me talking to a bunch of CEOs in a dark room, it's me talking to the public to try to enhance transparency. But our country hated the idea of having a central bank. So Alexander Hamilton created the first central bank. It lasted for, 10 or 20 years. They got rid of it. They had a second bank in the United States. They got rid of it. And then in the late 1800s, the U.S. economy was hammered with financial crises, including a big one, the banking panic of 1907. And then Congress said, well, even though we hate it, I guess we need to have a central bank. But if we're going to have one, we don't want it concentrated in Washington, D.C., all under the control of Washington. We want to distribute it around the country to have some checks and balances. So they created the Board of Governors in Washington. You know who Janet Yellen is. She's chair of the board. She and the other governors are appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed by the Senate. But then we have 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, including the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And I was appointed by a local board of directors. So on my board of directors is Jeff's chairman, Ken Powell, who is going to be the incoming chairman of my board of directors. He was very active in our search. And the local board of directors is who I report to. I don't report to the President of the United States. I don't report to the United States Senate. I report to our local board of directors. And that is meant to be, by design, a check on Washington so that I am representing our region. And our region includes Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Montana, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and northwestern Wisconsin. So I spent a lot of my time going out around the region, meeting with different groups to understand what's happening in the local economy.
I should have said at the beginning, and we sent Neel's bio to everybody, but he does have a remarkable career. He's worked in corporations like TRW. He spent time at Goldman Sachs. He was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury with Hank Paulson during a historic period, oversaw TARP, ran for governor in California unsuccessfully, but was in the arena. But it does beg a question, how do you get this job? Because you don't, I understand somebody selected, but how did you get this?
Well, each of the regional banks has its own board of directors of local leaders, and they conduct a search. And so a nationwide search was conducted. They hired a national search firm. I was contacted by the search firm, and I went through a multi-round interview process and kind of the way many searches go.
Good. Okay, so on to the substance of it. if I would have to capture all the things I've heard from people who attend G100 meetings about the economy, I think it always comes down to one question, which is, can the economy grow at more than 3% or not? And you hear every side, including we may never get there again, to it's disgraceful that we can't grow more at 3%. So you look at this for a living. Can the United States in the foreseeable future grow at 3%? And if so, what would it take?
Well, I'll tell you what it'll take. So we know economic growth really comes from two sources. One source is population growth. The other, what I'm going to talk about each individually. The other source is productivity growth. So our population is growing a lot more slowly than it did in prior decades. And that's number one, because we're having fewer kids. Fertility in advanced economies is going down. Fertility rates are going down because as we get wealthier, people are just having fewer and fewer kids. Now, we have supplemented our population growth with immigration in recent decades. That's been a huge competitive advantage for the United States. There's a global contest for people. We win that contest hands down if we want to. When I go around the district, I always say the same thing, which is you've got three choices as it relates to economic growth. Number one, you can accept slower growth. Number two, you can spend a lot of money to subsidize fertility. Right? Everyone laughs when I say it, but it's true. You can give out tax credits to families that have kids.
Singapore has done this.
You can provide free childcare. It's expensive, but you can do it. Or number three, you can embrace immigration. Those are your three choices. That's it. It's just math. And so I said this last week in Montana, and for the first time somebody said to me, you know, slower growth doesn't sound so bad. I've never had anybody say that to me before. I don't agree with slower growth. I think we need to look at the other options. So half of the equation is population growth. The other half of the equation is productivity growth. And this is a conundrum. We don't really understand why productivity in the US and in advanced economies generally is growing so slowly. It's growing much slower than it has in prior decades. And there are a number of different theories. One theory is that we're mismeasuring it, that maybe productivity is faster than we think. But if that were true, economic growth would be higher than we think and inflation would be even lower than we think. Number two, slow productivity growth is happening in advanced economies around the world. So we're all mismeasuring it together if we're mismeasuring it. Or another option that some people say is that we're just not inventing stuff that moves the needle right now. And I gotta say that resonates with me. If you compare this to 100 years ago when we had the introduction of electricity, you had running water, you had the internal combustion engine, you had the airplane, then the integrated circuit. Compared to those transformational technologies, Twitter and Facebook are just a rounding error, right? They're not transformative compared to those things. So where is the next real transformation going to come from? Now the optimism is, I have no idea. And we never have any idea where the next transformation is going to come from until it appears. So who knows? But I guess we have to look to your companies to try to come up with the next great innovation. And I'm going to shut up here in a second. The most important innovation that I've observed in the last decade in the economy is not from Silicon Valley, it's fracking. It has had a bigger effect on the global economy than anything out of Silicon Valley in the last decade. Lowering the cost of energy is an enormous factor in economic growth. So what's next? I don't know. So the optimism is maybe something great is around the corner, but we know it's not going to come from population growth unless all of a sudden we start having a lot more kids a lot more quickly, or we really open the floodgates on immigration.
So I'm going to leave that for this audience to respond to, but let me ask you about your second point, which is immigration people. I bet that if I went and spoke to every regional Federal Reserve governor, president, they would have the same view as you do on people. The country thrives from bringing in more people. I bet if I spoke to G100 members, 90% are in favor of some sort of immigration reform that would allow us to attract more people. They might differ on the shape of that reform, sure, but almost everybody. So what is it that our expert level community and our business community is getting wrong, that this message has not been able to be sold to the country in any format over the last decade? And this isn't about Trump.
Sure.
This is a problem that goes back 3 or 4 presidents.
You know, I think experts of all stripes have lost a lot of credibility in the last decade or so. And I'm going to overdo it. I tend to look at things through the lens of the financial crisis because that was a searing experience for me. It's like burned into me. I can't shake it. We've had certain principles as a country that have been passed down from generation to generation. One of those principles is a belief in free markets. And if you take a risk, you get the rewards, but you bear the consequences of that risk. That's a fundamental belief in America. Well, we shredded that in the financial crisis because we had to. We had to bail out the banks. They didn't deserve it, but if we didn't do it, it would have been devastating. We would have been in a Great Depression scenario. So I view what we did as violating a fundamental American belief that's been passed down for a very, very long time. And why did we do it? We said, you trust us, we're going to be in a Great Depression scenario if we don't. And I believe that's true, and I believe we did the right thing. But man, we spent our capital. And so now the people are saying, hey, we trust, okay, we took your words, and we've had this long, hard recovery, and we saw the banks get bailed out, and nobody went to jail. And you know what? I'm pissed off. And so we've had it with experts. And so I think this is manifesting itself on a lot of different issues right now, immigration being one, though I agree it went back probably earlier than that.
I'll ask you one more question, then we'll open it up and we'll get into any issue this group wants to talk about. The other thing I think we hear from business is the gap between the jobs available and the skills that are in the market. And I know you have spoken about this, and you and I talked about this last week. But almost every CEO of a Fortune 1000 company has jobs posted that they say they cannot fill. They can't fill them because they don't have people who have the skills. They don't have people who can pass a drug test. They don't have people who will show up reliably. First of all, do you think they're right? And if not, what is the nature of the jobs available versus skills?
Sure.
And what that gap is.
I'm glad you raised it. So this is a topic we're studying very carefully at the Federal Reserve. So the big conundrum that we're all trying to understand is the job market's gotten a lot stronger over the last 6 or 7 years. Right? We had a peak of 10% unemployment nationally. We're now at 4.2%. You would have expected in that transition that you all would be competing for workers with each other. Wages would climb quickly, and that would lead to inflation. Wage growth has been very low, surprisingly slow. And inflation has been low, not high, it's been low. And it's still, we have a 2% inflation target, which we can talk about. We're at around 1.3 or 1.4, looking, if you strip out some of the volatile energy and food prices. So we're coming up low, and we don't know why that is. So one theory that I have is there's more slack in the labor market than the headline numbers suggest. More people are still looking for work, and that's why we have not yet seen wage growth. Another theory is that I subscribe to is that inflation expectations have started to drift down because the Fed has been tightening monetary policy. And expectations actually really matter in what actually happens to inflation. So I have this conversation all the time with businesses large and small. And my message is simple. Are you raising wages? Usually the answer is no. And so I say to you, with all due respect, if you're complaining that you can't find workers and you're not raising wages, then you're just whining. Right? If I want more of something, I can't just close my eyes and wish for more of it to appear.
So you actually
pay more, and you get more.
So your argument is the wage set at an appropriate rate would bring people out of the woodwork, as it were.
It already is. I mean, we've been surprised the last several years. So if you look at the labor force participation, the percentage of Americans who are in the labor force, it's been declining the last decade or so because we know the population is aging. But even if you look at working age people, it's declined a lot after the recession. It's now been climbing back up. We're not all the way there, but they are responding as wages are slowly climbing. People are re-entering the job market, or they're not leaving. So people are responding to wages. But my test is, big question we have is, are we at maximum employment? We were talking about this at dinner. If I don't see wages climbing, then no, we're not at maximum employment. And the fact that you all are not, no, I'm not picking on you individually, the fact that the business community writ large is not bidding up prices for labor, that means there really is not a shortage. I'll believe it when it's in the numbers.
Questions for Neel? Who wants to start us off?
Or tell me I'm wrong. I mean, I'm here to learn as much as I'm here to share with you what I'm thinking.
Doug.
I guess the first, maybe it's a shortage of the qualifications that you need for that job. Not all higher wages is going to buy you skill. It might buy you a body, but not necessarily qualified ones. So is that what they're doing?
Doug suggested, if everybody heard that, it's a matter of qualifications, not just wages, that there really is a skill gap.
So that's fair, and I don't think, I ask at the Minneapolis Fed, I've been asking our HR department. So the Twin Cities has officially about a 3% unemployment rate. I ask our HR department, when we post a job, how many applicants do we get? 75. Of that, roughly 2/3, 50, call it, are meeting the qualifications, at least on paper. This is maximum employment? I mean, granted, the Federal Reserve may be viewed as a premium employer, and people, people respect the Fed. Some people, hopefully more people. But really, and so I've been involved in interviews myself where I'm interviewing candidates, and it's surprisingly, we're doing a search right now, which is public, for a new head of public affairs. And I went through every one of the qualified resumes myself, because I'm deeply involved in the search. 20% of the applicants who are very well qualified are doing what I would call one-person consulting companies. Neel's little comm shop. Because they're between full-time jobs. And so they're doing stuff to kind of bridge the gap. I bet if you looked at the statistics, I bet every one of them is counted as fully employed. And I bet they're not really fully employed. And so skills matters, but wages and skills go together. So if you raise wages, can you attract more people into that skill, or who have the right skills? I would guess the answer is yes.
So I'll give you some pushback on that we heard last week at one of our meetings. We had Nick Eberstadt, who's been a regular speaker at G100. You may know his work. He's an economist and demographer at the American Enterprise Institute. He says that working age men between the ages of 24 and 54, that the participation rate is lower in the United States than at any time in history, lower than after the Great Depression, lower than after the Depression in 1940. And he says part of the problem is opioids, which we know about, some people not, people sponging off a girlfriend or a spouse.
I don't think I'd call it sponging off, but...
But no, somebody else is earning the money,
Okay.
and they're not, and they decided to opt out of the workforce. And the third is they can't pass a drug test, and have decided through video games or something else that they'd rather do something else. And it's black market economy or some sort of undocumented. And that it really is someone who doesn't want, not so much the job at public affairs at your office, which sounds like a great job, but a job working for Hubert or for Jeff or for anyone else at a basic skill job. How do you respond to that?
I think there's certainly some truth to that. We know opioids are a factor. There's a professor at Princeton, Alan Kruger, who's done very important work on the opioid epidemic and its effect on the job market. As we look at his work, if we take his work at face value, we still have a year or two of continued job growth before we will have absorbed the non-opioid labor market slack. And the fact of the matter is, people make choices, right? So you're right. If you're going to offer me $8 an hour, maybe I'll play Xbox all day. If you're going to offer me $12 an hour, maybe I'm going to put the Xbox down. I mean, we don't know how people are going to respond to if wages start to climb. So we just don't know. But what I do know is we're not seeing high inflation. We're seeing inflation that's actually been falling, not climbing. So why not allow the labor market to continue to heal to see if we can bring some of these folks back into the labor force, since we do not have an inflation problem. If we have an inflation problem, it's that inflation is too low, not too high.
Questions? Yes. We'll go here and there and there.
Yeah, I'd like to challenge that just a little bit. You have a group of people here that you're talking to that are basically capitalist. Everyone's a capitalist at heart. And they know if they need something and they can't get it at that price, they ultimately will pay more. We all know how the business is run and what we need in order to succeed at our own enterprises. And if raising wages was fully the answer, that would have been done. So I'm not sure that that's not being tried across the industry as much as the issue of, is there an availability of the right kind of workforce for the positions that are out there? Not, are
Sure.
we paying the right amount of money for it? So if it's opioids, if it's a spouse or somebody else paying for it, deciding to live off one income, if there are other safety nets that people are living off of, going underground in an underground society, those must be having some effect, or else all those around the room and all other rooms like this would be bidding up. So I'm not so sure there's a conscious effort to keep the wages low and not bring them up?
Sure. Well, first of all, I didn't mean to suggest it's some conspiracy that there's some conscious effort to keep wages down.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is we're just not seeing wage growth. So what does that tell me? Again, I'm trying to assess. Imagine you're in my seat. I'm trying to assess, are we at maximum employment? And we're not seeing high wage growth. What does that tell you? As a capitalist, you said everybody in the room are capitalists. As a capitalist, that tells me we must not be at maximum employment.
But how does that work? There are openings, but you're saying that companies have made a decision not to raise wages for some reason, for economic reasons?
Well, no, maybe some businesses say, well, I can't afford to raise wages. If I raise wages, my competitors don't raise wages, then I'm not competitive anymore. Well, but we're thinking about the U.S. economy as a whole. So this is not just affecting your business or just affecting your business. If it's affecting you, it must be affecting your competitors. So if everybody in your industry is now having to raise wages because they're competing for the same talent, then you're not at a competitive disadvantage. It's a national market at least. So all I'm trying to do from my seat is assess, are we at maximum employment or not? And if the wage growth is low and inflation is low, that tells me we must not be.
We had a question back there, and then we'll go to Gene. Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so I'm a Dutchman. I don't know whether we're all capitalists at heart. You know, the Dutch are known to be socialist, although we are the mercantile kind of socialist. But three questions. One is, what's your view on minimum wages? Would it kickstart the economy if the U.S. would agree to raise minimum wages to say $15 an hour? So that's one. Two, what do you make of this story that the federal government is now selling that if we can get corporate income tax rates to 25%, that will translate into $4,000 per head on average increase? And third question that I would have, in my own country, the labor participation of people of 55 and older has doubled over the last 2 years. Is there any room for labor participation increases of older people? And I know it's very different because in the Netherlands, everybody would retire at age 55. We are fortunately corrected that. But is there any room in your view for better participation of older people?
Let's start with the minimum wage.
All right, so minimum wage, they're winners and losers. And I think policymakers need to be conscious of that. I would say I think this is something that needs to be decided locally because each local labor market, each local business environment is very different. You raise the minimum wage, it's going to help those who keep their jobs, and it's going to make it harder for those who don't have jobs. I mean, that's just basic. You understand that. Personally, the thing we were just talking about is a stronger overall economy, raising wages for everybody. Then you don't have winners and losers because the rising tide is lifting all the boats. So personally, I think just a stronger, more vibrant labor market is better than artificially doing it through the minimum wage. But again, I do think that it should be done at the local level. And if you're starting from a position of very low unemployment, there are probably fewer losers than if you're starting from a position of relatively higher unemployment on that. So I don't think that just a national very high minimum wage would necessarily be a net positive. I think there would probably end up being a lot of people who end up being harmed by it unintentionally. I don't know enough about the tax plan to know. I don't think, to my knowledge, a lot of details have not yet been released yet to know what it's going to mean for workers. I mean, my preference would be some type of revenue neutral tax cut. If I could design it myself, if I was emperor, I would design a revenue neutral tax cut. Some of you would like it, some of you probably wouldn't because some of you probably like some of the deductions that others aren't taking advantage of. One of the big poorly designed elements of our tax code is the interest deductibility of debt. It puts a huge premium on debt financing over equity financing, and it leads to all kinds of distortions which are not good for the U.S. economy. Leads to too big to fail, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd love to get rid of the preference of debt, just as an example. But I don't know what it's going to translate to into individual workers. And then what was 3?
Number 3 was the number of people over 55 who are in the workforce.
Yeah, it's actually been climbing here too. So as we've seen labor force participation surprise us to the upside, even though we have this demographic trend of it declining, a lot of those folks have been older Americans who are deciding to stay in the job market and not leave, or maybe re-enter, even though that traditionally you would have thought of them as being retired. And I think that's great. I think people working longer is good for them, it's good for society, it's good for all of our benefit programs, and if they're healthy and able to do it, that's great. That's a great choice that they're making. And part of the reason the male labor force participation is so low is because so many women in America work. And so, female labor force participation rocketed in the 80s and 90s and is now, I don't know if it's quite caught up to men, but it's close. So that is a great source of economic engine for our country. Now, that was a one-time windfall of women entering the labor force. They can't re-enter the labor force, they're already in. And so now it's not entirely surprising to see some male drop off because maybe you only need one breadwinner in the family and it happens to be the wife instead of the husband. But I do think the opioid issue, video games, these other issues are important.
Gene.
The definition of full employment is interesting because we have taken a lot of our investment dollars and driven that toward, really competitive positions to hire. So whether it's cybersecurity and positions where you just can't even find enough talent in the marketplace, which takes away then from maybe other positions where there's plentiful people to hire. So I don't, when you talk about the idea of full employment, we're spending dollars, but in a way that is really driving the best, what we feel is the best investment
Sure.
for our long-term success. And I don't know if it, if it necessarily translates to. I'm trying to connect with what you're talking about in terms of full employment, where you have the skill gap is very rare.
But for the skills you need that you put a real premium on, you're paying up for those.
We absolutely.
I know it, and so are we. So IT specialists, cybersecurity, clearly. Another example, one of the conundrums in the US economy, people look at, they say that mobility in America has declined dramatically in recent decades. People used to move all around the country. And I push back on that a little bit. I know the statistics show that mobility has declined a lot. I think people are willing to move for great opportunity. They're not willing to move for an extra $1 an hour. So look at North Dakota and the oil boom. They had people from all over the country flocking to North Dakota to work in the oil fields because it was a great economic opportunity for them. Well, when we have other great economic opportunities, people will pick up and move. So I guess I'm just not sure that the engine of America is broken, people are not willing to relocate. I think they are, but they're responsive to opportunity. They're responsive to good wages.
I'd be interested on the high-skill jobs that you talk about. Are you losing them to Google or Goldman Sachs, or are you finding another way to fill the high-end, high-skill job?
We're actually adding talent that we've never had before.
Yeah.
So it's gaps we're filling just to run the business
Sure.
as we grow.
Sure.
And then it's a very competitive environment. And it's interesting when you talk about the boom in North Dakota. I'm familiar with that. We have operations there, but the economics have to be there to support that as well.
Of course, absolutely. No, I totally get it. I totally get it. The economics have to be there. Again, for me, I'm looking at this not from your business's perspective or from the Twin Cities perspective. I'm looking at this from the national economy perspective. Unless you and all of your competitors are having to do this, then again, in which case you're not at a competitive disadvantage, then you see wages raised across the board.
I'd just be interested, show of hands, who thinks the economy in 2018 will be better than it was in 2017?
Global or U.S.?
U.S. Okay, so I'd say that's about a third of the room. What's your view?
I don't know. We're all disappointed at the kind of growth rates that we've been experiencing, but we kind of understand them now, given what's happening in productivity, what's happening in demographics and population. I don't see any big catalyst to change that dynamic. And so, for example, there's a lot of optimism in the public markets after the election last year. I did not change any of my economic forecasts based on any fiscal policy assumptions, just because I think the stock market is a lousy predictor of political outcomes. It didn't predict the November election. It didn't predict Brexit. Who knows if they're going to be able to predict tax reform or regulatory reform or immigration reform. So, if Congress passes something, we will analyze it. We'll put it into our models. But right now, I'm not counting on any kind of action from Congress that would change the growth trajectory of the country.
And you do not believe that infrastructure spending is going to make a difference on the economy. Is that right?
Well, I'm a little skeptical. You know, we've got this, it's almost like apple pie, where everybody just says, oh my gosh, American infrastructure is terrible, and we all point to Shanghai Airport as the example. Look at how great Chinese airports are. I don't believe fancier airports is going to lead to higher growth. I've lived in California, I've lived in Minnesota, Ohio, Illinois, DC. Everywhere I've lived, I've been within around 45 minutes of a decent airport where I could get anywhere I needed. First of all, the Twin Cities Airport, Minneapolis, it's a nice airport. If it was palatial, your businesses wouldn't grow any faster. Okay, so it isn't obvious to me. Our roads, yeah, we have some potholes. We have a lot of construction in Minnesota. I'm used to that now. But our roads are pretty good. So the idea that there's this massive bottleneck that's holding back U.S. economic growth, I don't see it. Now, have we underinvested in repairs and maintenance? Probably. Do we need to make those investments? Yes. But is that holding back U.S. growth? Hard for me to see. Push back.
If you have a Super Bowl coming, that helps too. So.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah.
Go ahead, Mike.
So does any of this discussion around labor participation and the lack of wage growth, does it infer productivity? You know, that maybe we don't, technology conversion. So if you're sitting there, you can't fill skill, but you have some flexibility across your enterprise. You can, maybe it's not directly, but you have some alternatives. And does that start to show maybe where some of the productivity is showing?
Well, so that's a good point. That's a possibility. So people have said, you know, if you did, somebody asked about the minimum wage, you do a big minimum wage increase. Now the fast food joints start putting in robots and automation, et cetera. Very possible. And so that's a theory on why wage growth has been low, is because businesses can either hire more people or automate. But that would then suggest that productivity should be higher, not lower. Right. If all of a sudden you guys are saying, well, I'm not going to hire, it's too expensive, I'm going to put in all these robots, productivity growth should be higher. But we're not seeing that. And that would imply that inflation is even lower. So you can't just do one of these adjustments and say, well, this one thing is mismeasured, because it actually affects all these other measurements that we're also making too. So I do think that this is happening. I do think automation has been around forever in different forms, and it's here to stay, and it's a source of productivity growth, but it's not happening at the scale that is showing up in the numbers in any meaningful way.
Yes, we have Hubert. And then Stephanie.
So Neel, you talked briefly about the issue of measuring economic growth. Could you elaborate on this? Because I think it's a difficult topic. More and more the economy is in intangible sectors or technology sectors. How do you assess the deflator of the economy when you go from iPhone 7 to iPhone 8?
Yeah.
If the level of precision is plus or minus 1%, that's essentially the difference between high growth and
sure.
Yeah. How do you measure growth with any precision?
Exactly.
Well,
yeah.
There are very important, though they're unsung heroes, but very important professional economists working for the federal government, whether it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics and others, that are crunching these numbers and getting wide data sources and always making adjustments. And the best economists are looking at it, saying, hey, there are these seasonal adjustments you need to make, and they're always trying to update their formulas, looking at iPhone 7 to iPhone 8 and iPhone X. So they're doing the best that they can. But again, if growth is actually higher than we think, because we're mismeasuring the iPhone, as an example, then inflation is lower than we think. And so then we need to answer that question. Why is inflation lower than we think? And by the way, a lot of these trends, like technology may be designed here, and it's produced, let's say, in China, but then it's adopted globally. So productivity tends to be an advanced economy thing, that they all adopt these technologies at the same rate. So we know that productivity growth appears to be very low in all advanced economies. We know that inflation appears to be low in all advanced economies. We know that growth tends to be muted in all advanced economies. Maybe they're all making the same mismeasurement errors, or maybe the same underlying trends are happening around the world. I'm more in the camp of the latter. A big source of error that we know is healthcare, because the quality of care that we're getting is improving your life. You're living longer. Maybe you don't need a second knee replacement in 10 years. Maybe that knee replacement now survives for your whole life. All sorts of improvements that are very hard to capture, admitted. But the best experts who look at this are doing their very best and are constantly trying to refine their methods to account for it. That's the best we can do.
Stephanie.
I'd just be curious, so back to minimum wage and job creation, how you think about that relative to the trend. The research shows 25 to 30% of our workforce is choosing freelance or independent contractor as a career, given the flexibility, the optionality, and that's only growing. I think projections suggest 40% of our workforce by 2020. So I'd be curious of your perspective on that relative to wage, relative to economy, and more curious on the longer term effects of that and how we should think about that.
Yeah, so I don't know the longer term effects of a more contract-based economy. It sounds like a more flexible economy where talent can move around to the best opportunities and be put to the best use. So it sounds on some level like it may be a benefit, more flexibility. One of our strengths, Hubert and I were talking about, the U.S. labor market versus the French labor market. And the U.S. labor market is much more flexible, and that is a real benefit to our economy, in my view, having that type of flexibility. At the same time, there are undoubtedly costs on those individuals who have lack of certainty on how long they're going to be at a given company, where is their next paycheck going to come from, et cetera. So I think there are pros and cons, and I do think my own experience tells me if we see a stronger labor market in traditional jobs, I think you'll see more people opting into those traditional jobs than remaining part of the contracting economy because they have to. And then this affects things like healthcare and benefits, et cetera, as well.
Yes.
Neel, are you a believer in the global economy? And if you are, what are some of the things we can do from a policy perspective to mitigate some of the populist tendencies?
It's about the global economy versus the populist hostility to the global economy, if I may say.
Well, I mean, a believer in the global economy, I mean, of course, right? I mean, I think the global markets are just going to become more important in the future. They're already important today, they're just going to become more important in the future. And the United States needs to be positioned to compete globally. And by the way, I think we have the resources and the people to compete and win against anybody. So as much, by the way, as much as it feels frustrating sometimes here, like we've got a lot of problems and we don't know how to solve them, I really wouldn't trade places with anybody in the world by miles. So I'll trade our problems, I'll keep our problems, all day long. What was the second part of your question?
Well,
Just so how do you, given the fact that
Oh, the populism.
global economy, so how do you counteract some of the forces
Yeah.
shown up in politics around populism?
There's no simple answer. I mentioned earlier about the anger about the financial crisis that I do think is still with us. I do think, the U.S. economy has been in transition forever. So when automation was brought to the ag sector, people said that's the end of labor. And then they moved into factories and they got different types of jobs. And I'm sure that transition was really difficult for individual men and women, or mostly men back then, who were working the farms. I bet that was a damn hard transition for them to make. But as an economy, we made it very, very successfully. So I think we're going to make future transitions that will be disruptive. I think self-driving cars is going to be really painful for cab drivers and truck drivers. I think we will make that transition as a country, and I think as an economy, we will do well for it. But it's putting an increased premium, and you already know this, on skills. So a lot of my time I'm spent looking at education policies in and around our region, nationally. How do we equip our workforce with the skills they need to compete globally? And you already know this, but every year, skills become more and more and more important, and that's not going to slow down. I mean, a lot of the dislocation of workers is not from globalization, it's from technology. And that's not going to slow down, that's just going to keep going. And so how do we compete that? We don't want to turn the technology clock back. We want to embrace technology, but give our workers the skills they need to be winners.
If I could just push a little bit more on that, because, I think everybody in this room is in agreement with your general point. Is it possible that there isn't some truth to the argument that having a global economy in which companies are free to choose to send jobs to low-wage countries, where we have to compete against companies that pay workers a fraction of what they may be paid here, doesn't that actually lead to a United States that does look different? Yes, eventually they migrate to jobs, but maybe there's a generation of people who go without them. And I guess the hard question to you might be, in a global economy, do you see an American employment level between 3 to 5% unemployment for the foreseeable future? Or is the United States going to enter a period in which high unemployment starts to become the norm?
I think the only way, it's not a question of high unemployment or low unemployment. I think the question is what the wages are. If we wanted a high unemployment structural economy, we would embrace European labor market reforms. You know, very high minimum wage, very high unemployment benefits, and you can raise structural unemployment. I don't see us necessarily doing that. But I do think the question is, what are the wages? People are going to work. Americans want to work by and large. We're a working culture. The question is, what wages are people earning when they're in those jobs? And there are, you know, the case you made, I could easily have said when automation came to farms. You could say the exact same thing. Isn't this terrible? Automation is going to ruin the lives of all these men and women who are working on these farms. We would have been crazy to have turned our backs on that automation as a country, even though there are, you know, real local costs, real costs on individuals. So policies that try to help people with that transition, but I'm going to admit to you, I'll be the first to admit to you, those are really hard to pull off, especially at any kind of scale. But those can be supportive. There are no easy answers. I mean, we're better off embracing the future than trying to hold on to the past. I'll tell you that.
Hubert.
So, I was born and raised in France, so forgive me for the naivety of my question. Can you describe the role of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis versus the system in Washington, your job versus Janet Yellen, what decisions do you make, what does she, how
Sure.
do decisions get made, what role do you play locally?
Sure.
Would you mind walking us
No,
through that?
happy to. So let's start with monetary policy. So she's obviously the chair of the board. She sets the agenda for the meetings, the range of options that we're considering. I mean, the chair is where, you know, the chair is the man or woman. That's the chair. The regional Reserve Bank presidents, we are rotating voters when we vote. So this year I'm a voter on our open market committee decisions.
The FOMC.
The FOMC. And then for the next 2 years, I will not be voting. Other people will be voting in my place, and then I'll come back on cycle and vote again. And again, this was all by design to try to balance out the power so that it's not the whole monetary policy is not just dominated by Washington, D.C. That was the design that Congress had. So my vote on interest rates is mine. And I'm not under orders from anybody to vote a certain way. I just use my best judgment. I have my own team of excellent economists here at the Minneapolis Fed that I work closely with to look at the data, to look at different economic models, and to come up with my best recommendation. And so this year, while I've been voting, we've raised interest rates twice, in March and in June, and I was the sole dissent voting against those interest rate increases. Now, so I was free to vote that way because that's the way I believe. I looked at the data and I don't see the inflation, so why are we raising interest rates? But it was a vote. And I was the only one who voted no, so guess what? We raised rates. You know, one vote per person, so to speak. So that's separate. We do, all the reserve banks do collaborate on a lot of things. So we share a lot of our IT resources to try to save money because it doesn't make sense for each bank to have its own complete cybersecurity and IT department, et cetera. Bank regulation, we regulate banks in the district. The policies are set in Washington, and then they're carried out by the Reserve Bank so that we're treating all the banks in the country under the same policy framework, as an example. We supply cash to you, to all of your ATMs. That cash starts out of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. The policies around how so your bank will send us old cash. We have machines that'll sort it and shred it and then send out new cash. All of that is regulated centrally so that all the reserve banks do that the same. So there's some things that are standardized where it makes sense, but then the core policy judgments are completely independent with each bank.
I didn't want to ask you about monetary policy for fear that people would rush out of the room immediately, but since you raised it, there has been this decade, maybe longer debate about whether we should raise interest rates. What's wrong with raising interest rates when we've been pretty close to zero for certainly since the crisis?
So the way we think it works is when we want to stimulate economic activity, we lower rates. That makes it cheaper for you to get a loan from your bank or to buy a house, and that stimulates economic activity. We want to tap the brakes, we raise interest rates to do that. Well, again, the trade-off, the way we think it's supposed to work, think of a seesaw. You have unemployment on one hand and you have inflation Unemployment gets up, there's a lot of free labor available, inflation is low. Unemployment gets really low, you guys are competing for workers, inflation gets up. Well, now we're in this odd situation that unemployment appears low and inflation is low. It's not supposed to work that way. So I'm saying, well, let's let it keep, it seems like a pretty high-class problem. Unemployment is low and inflation is low. What exactly are we worried about? So I'm just simply saying, let's allow the labor market to continue to heal until we see one of these things start to move, and then we can tap the brakes if we need to. Remember, we have infinite power to lower inflation. If inflation gets too high, we can always raise rates to bottle it up. But if inflation is too low, we hit zero. And we have very limited tools on the other side. So this is a no-brainer to me.
Does anybody disagree? Please.
Yeah, I strongly disagree. Because I think the effect of the massive amount of quantitative easing at microeconomic level is that we're scaring the living daylight out of every boardroom in the United States.
Are you all scared?
Everybody looks at it and says, okay, the patient has now been on life support for the last 10 years with massive amounts of cash flow coming in, and still the patient isn't growing by faster than 2%. So let's assume that at some point in time, this gravy train will stop. How healthy is the patient? It's like a doctor who has somebody on life support and says to the visiting family, get ready because he's going to be running a marathon. So invest in new plants and facilities. So I think you vastly underestimated the psychological effect of the quantitative easing. I'm not going to be holding off on buying a house because I think that maybe it's 1% cheaper a year from now. I'm going to be holding off on buying a house because I think that the economy still looks very shaky, as evidenced by the fact that the Fed is pumping an unlimited amount of money into the economy.
Okay, so just so other folks heard you, maybe the Fed, I'm just going to recap what you said, make sure I get it right. Maybe the Fed with its low interest rates and quantitative easing is just scaring everybody, and that's what's leading to slower economic growth and less investment. That's not crazy. But, use your doctor example. The economy is not showing signs of this runaway growth. So the economy had a massive heart attack in 2008. I'm going to stick with your medicine example. Long, hard recovery. And you know what? The doctor comes along and says, you know what? Just get out there and start running. You may not feel up to it, but we'll all feel better if you just go ahead and start running. I mean, I would love to just pretend that everything's fine in the US economy. We've got strong growth, we've got high inflation, we can sustain higher interest rates, but we're not seeing it in any evidence. And by the way, go back in time for a moment. The Federal Reserve and central banks all around the world adjust interest rates around a long-term trend. So the long-term trend globally has been interest rates doing this since 1980, when Volcker stepped in and crushed inflation. Real interest rates around the world have gradually been declining over 30 years. And along the way, the Fed has been adjusting interest rates around that neutral level. But the neutral has been falling. The reason that neutral has been falling is because demographics and productivity growth set where that neutral rate is. And it's not just in the US. It's happening in Europe, it's happening in Japan at an even accelerated rate. And so the question is, you may have in your head that, well, we need to get back to 4%. But if neutral has changed, shouldn't we pay attention to that?
I don't have that in my head at all. I think as a result of demographic changes, society will continue to save more. So I think there is a saving surplus, and that will drive rates very low. And the fact that you're saying the Fed is varying around a trend line that is coming down basically means that the Fed doesn't have all that much impact on real long-term inflation rates. So you're not really influencing the inflation, or you're not really influencing the interest rates by varying around it. You are incurring all the costs of the psychological effect. And the monetary authorities in Europe and in Japan are conducting an experiment that has never been done before. And if you read up on this, you sit there and think, how on earth are we ever going to get out of this without major damage? The Japanese, impossible that we'll get it right. pretty much. The Europeans have to have a lot of luck, and the US will have to have a fair amount of luck to get at the end of this.
So what would you, if you were chair of the Fed, what would you do?
I think that what needs to happen in this country is the politicians need to show that they can actually solve the really big.
Okay, but hang on, hold on. Now you're punting. You're punting. You got to ask me a tough question, but I want to ask you an answer. You're at the Fed. You're chair of the Fed. You don't get to control what Congress does. What are you going to do?
You're giving the politicians essentially a put. So I think it's time to signal to the politicians, look, we're not going to be buying your debt wholesale. You're going to have to get off on your bikes and do something. And we are gradually, in the next 2, 3, 4 years, we're going to go back to normal.
Okay, so in September, the Federal Reserve announced that we're beginning the process of shrinking our balance sheet. And that process has now begun. And it'll take, just so you said, 3 or 4 years to return to a more normal level. So are we doing exactly what you suggested?
Yeah, I know. So I'm just taking issue with we're keeping rates low. I think it's very healthy that the Fed is starting to talk about, no, it's going to become normal. We're going to go back to normal trendline interest rates. We're going to get the patient health life support. And the faster we do it, the better it is. Because the easy money that is being pumped into the economy, I don't think it does anything at a micro level, neither at a household level nor at a company level. I think companies are, and it's certainly true for my own company. We sit on the best balance sheet that we've ever seen. We're very much on the level. Interest rates are really low. So the argument is, let's go and buy a big company, or let's go and do a very big expansion. Well, I need a lot of convincing of my board members, because they're all saying, you know what, it doesn't feel that good, eh?
Okay, but I'm sorry to spend everybody's time on this.
No, this is a good
But
conversation
you
for
really
us.
think in your board that if the Fed had just said over the last year, well, we're going to raise rates a lot more aggressively, that would change that dynamic? That's what's causing your board anxiety? Really?
I think that if the Fed would be making very consistent signals,
I think that is actually the
the
point.
sooner we get back to normal, the better it is. We see a lot of room. We're willing to take some downside risk. We're going to lean into it rather than the Fed has been leaning into it on a couple of times, and at the first into trouble, you say, whoa, no, that's not really what we intended. So I think the Fed should lean into it and say, okay, we're going to go back to normal. We're going to get out of the economy. We're going to stop an accelerated pace, buying all of this paper, and the economy has to stand on its own. And if it really goes wrong, okay, then we'll get back in. Because the next recession, you don't have any instruments anymore.
I know.
So if I could just echo, because we have heard this at our meetings before, in part, it's not the economics, it's the unpredictability and the sense that you're waiting for this quarterly election where the Fed may or may not raise rates 25 basis points is what makes people nervous. And so if I may interpret what the question was saying, and you raised a lot of good points, is in a way what business wants is a set of rules that would be a little bit more predictable that they could count on.
I hear you,
because
but
right now, and if you see in this room, if you ask people about the economy, there's a lot of nervousness.
Yeah, but there should be. I mean, I can't give you a rule that says this is exactly how the economy is going to evolve over the next 2 years. I wish I could. You know, I bet you all wish your businesses, you had a crystal ball and you knew exactly if customers are going to buy this new product or not. Boy, that'd be great. So it's easy to just say, boy, I wish we had perfect predictability, but the fact of the matter is the economy is evolving in ways that none of us have experienced before.
So I promised to get everybody out by 9, so why don't I ask a fun question just to end it, and then we'll let you go. How many years will it be till I walk into one of Hubert's stores and buy something with Bitcoin or cryptocurrency?
That's probably up to Hubert. He could probably do it tomorrow if he wanted to.
Yeah, but you're in charge of payments here.
You know, I'm skeptical of the of Bitcoins and the virtual currencies, not because I think that they're necessarily nefarious, but I don't think they're a credible competitor to government-issued currency. And the reason is this. The key selling point for Bitcoin when they designed it was that you could never have runaway inflation because they control the number of Bitcoins that can ever be produced by algorithm. It's set at the start. So you can never have runaway inflation. That's the key selling point. The problem is the barrier to entry for me creating my own Bitcoin and you creating your own Bitcoin is almost zero. So there's all these other altcoins out there. And if you go back in American history, there was a time when Massachusetts had its own dollar, and New York had its own dollar, and Virginia had its own dollar. And you had current runaway inflation by fact you had all of these unreliable currencies and nobody knew what to trust. There's only $1 US dollar backed by the United States government. And so that's an advantage that no virtual currency, I believe, will ever have. So we're paying attention, we're watching it, we'll see, but I don't think it's going to be a credible replacement to the dollar anytime soon.
You know, it is my opinion from being at G100 that the Federal Reserve System is one of the sort of unheralded gems of American life. It attracts the best economists, the best researchers, the best statisticians, the best people who know about labor, and they're all over the country. We've had a lot of exposure to them. The head of the San Francisco Fed came to one of our meetings at his own initiative. Rob Kaplan, the head of the Dallas Fed, has been with us, and we did dinner with him in Houston. I mean, they are in every city where they are. They're great people, enormous expertise, incredibly professional. And most of all, they attract amazing people who are public-spirited and believe in public service, and their ability to attract somebody like Neel, I think is a testament to all that. So I am very grateful that you come and just spend time with us and get into us. You're a figure to watch, and I hope all of you have sort of learned something and learned how much you can learn from his organization and from him too. So thank you very much. What a lovely evening. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
That was great. Has that job been filled?